And it starts with the work on parent involvement. So that's sort of like how we started to build, that's how we start to build a sense of relationship with families and with parents. And we have had lots of research that points us to ways to think about how do we sustain learning by involving parents in schools. And of course, we have the work of Epstein on the 6 types of involvement framework. I think it was written in 1992. So it's been a framework that has been ongoing. It's a typology, right, of our practices of partnership, assisting with parenting, communicating with parents, organizing, volunteering activities for parents, involving parents in learning in home activities. In another one of those points is including parents in decision making, and then of course collaborating with family. This is comprehensive, right? So any kind of work with parents invites us to consider this various different points of entry into building communication with parents. But what this makes me think too is that any typology and any of the frameworks we work with will have to be contextualized in a history of our practices, in the history of our schools. So for immigrant families in particular, and later we could talk a little bit more about like family itself, the definition, right? There has been a difficult way to understand families. And I say this because we have a history of having a majority dominant group and a minoritized, racialized group, right? And so like there's this difference, and our typologies need to pay attention to our power dynamics, for example, right? They need to pay attention to deficit frameworks that have been ongoing, right, in our public discourse, in our practices, right? In the 60s, we've had President Johnson's War on Poverty, the Moynihan Report, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So like these are all reports like A Nation at Risk, that they're all meant to produce a way for families to catch up, for us to be, if we're going to have partnerships with families, well, we have to make sure that they're, at some level before we can work, right? And I think that what we're doing in the past few years is kind of challenging that a little bit and shifting the way we understand families as partners and partnerships with families and communities, right? And so I think that starting with again, thinking about and love to hear other settings, but working with immigrant families, even the nuclear family model that we're so used to and may have been part of those earlier typologies and frameworks for building partnerships, are all of a sudden a little bit too short on the legs. We need other ways to think about families. Our families are extended and transnational. And so it's an invitation to think about, okay, if I'm going to have partnership, we're going to create partnerships with families and communities, we have got to think of beyond the local community and to think about those relationships that still impact that young child in our classrooms, those parents, right, dropping off their kids at school. It's connected. So I'm going to stop there for a little bit and then see if you have thoughts on this, and how is this sounding to you?
That's such an important perspective that you bring, like bringing us from sort of, well, both the sort of majoritized 1960s perspective of bringing families and children up to whatever this sort of normal level was that didn't probably ever really exist, but how we're now able to, we're sort of, thanks to the work of many like you, we're able to sort of begin to understand that it's not so much about that as about meeting halfway or meeting beyond halfway, and sort of understanding and building from the strengths that those families, those extended transnational families, multilingual families, bring to the table and to the educational scenario. And you know, I fully agree with that perspective, and the sort of you know, I go back always to my own mentor, Richard Ruiz, and his wonderful language as resource orientation, to sort of say, no, it's not about you know, a problem for the minoritized learners. It's not even about just their right to use their language. It's actually going to be better for everybody if we collaborate together and build together, rather than, you know, setting some norm that we expect others to reach. Others, the whole concept of others also. Unmute, unmute. Yep.
You said something really, really important, which is a point of thinking about families in terms of extended transnationally, because the moment we do that, we are opening the door to the multilingualism that is already in families, right? And so that is, to me, like the gates are open. And in a lot of what I have seen in the work that I do has to do with intergenerational dynamics. And intergenerational dynamics often pull from multilingual resources, in the case of the work that I do, at the hemispheric level, at that scale, right? So it's not just like Oakland or San Francisco, which is very rich in terms of its multilingualism, but it's varieties, the talk of elders, right? The language of peers across from the different regions, right? Yeah.
Right, and you think of language and literacy and culture, identity, the sort of the cultural funds of knowledge that across these generations, it isn't necessarily just reading and writing. It's the whole you know, repertoire of knowledge that we're drawing on and working with. I know that we need to move on probably to our second question, so let me bring Igone, our other facilitator, into this picture. Igone, would you join us, please?
Yes, of course, and thank you so much, Patricia. I really appreciate your work, and I couldn't agree more with what you've said, and also, you know, what Nancy has mentioned, and especially the fact that, you know, we are all better off for it, right? We all benefit for it. It'd be great to hear some specific examples from your research about these partnerships between families. And I know you've also worked with Indigenous, like Nancy said, Indigenous families from Latin America. So the partnerships between them, the school staff, and also researchers, right, at universities like you, your team, and other people that do this kind of work. So what do those partnerships look like?
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk about this, the projects that I've been working on for the past few years with the support from the Spencer Foundation. I have been working, I am from Yucatan. I'm part of this community in many ways, although our paths of migration have been incredibly different. And I always want to make sure that I respect those differences. But there are certain areas in our work that that coalesce around shared experiences of the past, of Indigenous background, of the land that, is in Yucatan and what it affords for us in terms of thinking back of, multiple locations of home, for example. But I have been working with a growing population, and I say growing since the 90s, and a little bit before. Some of the families started with the Bracero program, so it's been a while that migration is taking place between California and Yucatan. And one of the reasons I always like to make sure that I mention some of the reasons why people move, right? And this goes back especially to Indigenous communities that are now in the United States, for example. A lot of it has to do with the same issues that are happening here, that happen here to Native American communities, which is land loss, and land loss to economic treaties, to selling the original land for profit because the economy is not that great, right? And so with social networks already established across regions, from Yucatan, which is in the southeastern part of Mexico, closer to Central America. So there has been a lot of movement, a lot of indigenous movement across this part of the hemisphere. And so there are networks in San Francisco, there are networks in Los Angeles, there are networks in Marin County here and also in Northern California. And so I've been working with a community that it's a pseudonym because it is a research project. It started as a research project, Metropolitan Elementary School, which is a K-5 school, an elementary school, where the start, and this, I know we're going to talk about possible policy changes, but this community, for the most part, I would say, maybe like 10 years ago, was not really visible and was subsumed under the Latinx category, as it happens very frequently, right? Especially if there are names that are like Spanish speaking, right? So like they kind of immediately, the students upon entering school were classified as Latinx, potentially Mexican, right? Or and so, but this is a very different population. And there are learners of Spanish. And the parents with whom I work, for them, Spanish is a second language. Some don't speak Spanish. So it's a multilingual setting already, right? That is a sort of like an inherited kind of language setting. And so important for me and the families and the school was to think about a way to make visible that presence, right? Because in conversations with the Office of the Parent Liaison, the school, the teachers, the students and my team in the classrooms, we were like, wait, there is it's not just one or two families. So we conducted a survey, a language background questionnaire. And so at the time when we did this, the school was 25% Maya out of 250 more or less students, right? So wait a minute, this is a population, right? This is seriously a group that's growing, and that it is, it has particular language gifts and knowledge and needs. So like working to create alongside the dual immersion Spanish-English curriculum, ways to integrate, ways to recognize, revalorize Indigenous language, culture, and present. And I think that one comment right now for how to work with families in the partnership is for us, it was starting slow in a sense, but importantly, revalorizing, right? Sort of like recognizing and noticing is a step that is recursive, right? But because it had not been examined before, it took us a little bit more time to, okay, we need to do activities that sensitize everyone to, Latinx communities are multiple, diverse, right? What we are calling Latinx communities in the United States, right? So that's sort of like a way to get started with our partnerships. And eventually, I'm a learner of Yucatec Maya. So of course, the parents are speakers of Yucatec Maya. But we also run into a situation where, well, it would be great to have the parents teach the children more formally. There is a factor of time and a respect of time, right, for parents. So our partnership extended to Yucatan to invite teachers to come visit and offer workshops, and therefore creating, a partnership that included at 2 offices in Yucatan that will provide resources, and I mean, our teachers would come with boxes of materials for us to distribute and work with those materials in our workshops at the school with parents. I'll stop here and see if there are more comments, and what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm just reading a comment in the chat. That's awesome. So somebody, Sharon, thinks that's awesome.
Great.
So I'm looking at the clock, and I see that there's not a lot of time, and I definitely want to leave some time for questions. But since this is research to policy, we do have to ask that question, right? A policy question. And it seems to me that a lot of the work that you do is based on that importance of cultivating those practices that facilitate collaborations between families. In the case that you were speaking about, Indigenous families and school staff, so that they are able to determine their own needs and action plans, some of which may be different from community to community, right? But is there anything that could be done from a policy perspective? Any changes that you'd like to see that might help with this, really important work and make it more common practice, perhaps spread those collaborativo practices, across the country?
Thank you. This is such a great question. And here I'm going to make this revelation of vulnerability. I know when I started in the field of education and language education, that policy to me seemed to be something that others did, right? That it was, okay, then we give this, let's give it to the policymakers, let them deal with it. And over the years, I have come to understand that my role as a professor and as a member of these partnerships and this work that is so important to try to revalorize Indigenous groups and languages in particular requires that we do those first steps at policy, drafting and making, right? At least to come up and to think of a set of principles or a set of, this is a beginner's how to sort of if no other reason than to have more people help us out, right? Because this requires, a lot of work of community. But one area where I've observed over the course of the research and of the partnership is that entry into the bureaucracies of the school and the practices of the school, we need to work on those to design a different welcoming tool, right? To design a different way to include families, and to starting with some areas require, some states and districts are, there's differences in terms of like how we make sense of who's coming in, right? But we do need to have a sense of language and culture, right? And we need to have this intergenerationally. We often stop at the nuclear family or even just the child, right? What does the child speak? And at home is big, it's a concept, right? It could include many adults and siblings and extended families. And so we need to figure out who else is in this home setting, right? So our tools need to be amplified to be able to capture that range of possibility and a range of activity, right? So I think that that's one, and we've talked about thinking about operating with the definition of family that is not nuclear, so only that we have transnational families and extended families as the default setting. And I think that that will really help us, be prepared for, again, expansion, right, rather than narrowing down. Yeah. And even like just minimally to have ways to know if we need translators, right? So like that is just from the beginning to get us started with that, right? And then an expansive curriculum that has to include transnational ideas and knowledge, right? So a global curriculum is, as part of the curriculum, as part of expanding our dual language curriculum, multiple language curriculum. And I say one more thing, which is that we don't often talk about when we are working in particular with Indigenous students, is that we need to pause and make sure that we outline and make clear that we are sometimes working with sovereign nations, right? We are not talking about nation states like Mexico or Guatemala, right? But we are talking with people who are trying to regain sovereignty, right? And that sovereignty, I think Richard Ruiz and Luis Moll were also started to talk about sovereignty in education, right? That parents and communities can and should determine what is good for their children as Indigenous children in migration to know and learn, right? So I still have a long ways to figure out policy, but to me, these are kind of like stepping stones that can lead to potential changes. What do you think?
Those are, I think, can I say, Igonne, that those are, I love that. I thought those were very specific policy implications from growing from a very complex and large scenario. But you said specifically, better entry processes into the school bureaucracy and the practices for families and communities. And secondly, the work, like envisioning the curriculum as much more expansive and taking into account these issues of language and culture and multilingualism and intergenerationality. Not that families are not, just these nuclear local bodies of 4 people or whatever. They're and then finally the issue of sovereignty in the sense of parents having a role beyond just consuming, right? They're actually producing knowledge and sharing it. So back to the school, and I really think those are valuable implications that you pointed to. I know that our time is running short, and I know I've been trying to look at the chat comments. There was one earlier about bringing heritage language schools into this equation now, and I think, I don't know how you respond to that, Patricia. I know that for many Indigenous languages, that's still a sort of a dream, but the concept of heritage language, I think, is certainly one that you're talking about.
I think that exactly, and I think this is such a great question because, it's so easy. We learn to compartmentalize and put like, ESL is here, EFL is here, heritage language is here, right? And so they're helpful because they allow us to think about like specific forms of curriculum, right? But look at it expansively, right? They're all language learning processes. And one method in one can be helpful for the other, right? And so, like they invite creativity. I mean, to me, it's when I see this situation. And of course, heritage language learning can be, Yiddish. It can be, any language from immigrants of other immigrant groups as well, right? And certainly in some generations of Indigenous people already in the United States or across the hemisphere, in my case, also applies. So yes, just an invitation to yes, keep considering the different forms of language study and language teaching, but to also see that it's possible to draw from them, right? Because what we want are the questions and the approaches that generate a multiplicity of interventions and supports. Yeah.
Thank you. I know we have to wrap up, so I'll turn it back to Althea. Thank you, Patricia, so very much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
All of you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you all. A big thank you to our speakers today. Greatly appreciate your presence. This was very engaging. Thank you so much to our participants. We greatly appreciate your presence as well. Just to let you know, I'm dropping a link for our survey so you can let us know how we did today. Also, a recording of this webinar will be sent out tomorrow, and it will be also posted on cal.org, and it will be on YouTube. So we thank you so much for your presence. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.